Christmas on a Rational Planet. Lawrence Miles. A prologue. Necessary secrets. There were two kinds of darkness. It was one of those things that children always forgot the moment they were old enough and big enough to reach the light switch. The ordinary kind, the dull kind, came and went night by night, just a backcloth. Big and black and wet, coloring in the sky and framing the city lights outside the bedroom window. It was the other kind you had to watch out for, the kind that lived at the back of the cupboard and in the mystical dimension behind the sofa, the kind that kept secrets, that swallowed lost toys and hinted at futures you could only ever half understand. True darkness. Monster darkness. And when Roz Forrester looked up, that was the color of the sky. There was a sun, somewhere up there, but it was black, and impossible. Fluorescent black, turning the desert into a great bruise-colored shadow that stretched all the way to the horizon and vanished over the edge of the world. Only under the rocks, where the sun couldn't reach, was there any kind of illumination. Pools of sticky yellow light. The world's been turned inside out, she thought. Shadows where the light should be, light where the shadows should be. Arizona. That was the last place, the last real place, she remembered. After the TARDIS had left Mars, the Doctor had started poking and prodding at the console, as if that'd make the machine go faster. There were things to do, he'd said. Yamaya, he'd added. What about it? Loose ends. After we paid our last respects to Sleepy, Bernice asked if we should pop back and see how the whole thing started. Sleepy's progenitor had telekinetic powers. He vanished just after you dropped in on him. All research records of the Di1 Kasumu company spontaneously erased themselves once we'd left Yamaya for an impressive feat, even for the most influential of corrupt megalomaniacal corporations. Roz had raised a quiet eyebrow. What are you suggesting? Single quote. The Doctor had waved his hands in an agitated fashion. Nothing. But I hate loose ends. I hate feeling that there are things I don't know about going on behind my back. Liar, Roz had mumbled. So he'd kept on prodding, and had spent the next few days shifting the TARDIS from one end of creation to the other, looking for leads no one else would have recognized. Showing his face at seances, having tea with black magicians, poking his nose into the psychic nooks and crannies of human history. He'd had an audience with Madame Blavatsky, and shuffled through Nostradamus's drawers while the great man had been out on the raz. He won't mind, the Doctor had assured Roz. He'll leave a note for his wife. She's the practical one in the household, you know. Single quote. Finally, they'd visited Arizona during the last days of the American Empire, where the Doctor had expected to find a convention of half-crazed telepathic UFO abductees. But there had been no convention. Just a desert. Not like this one. A normal desert. A proper desert. With a body in it. Then she heard it, the sound of raw, wet flesh grinding against rock, and realized that the creature, the alien, the monster, was following her up out of the ravine. She'd hoped that it wasn't capable of climbing, but by the sound of it, and she wasn't going to look back to make sure, it had scaled the ravine wall faster than she had. She kept running. She remembered the first time she'd seen one of the creatures, as a corpse, lying out in the Arizona sun, the Doctor stumbling across it, standing over its body. Like the judge of the dead, a look of disapproval erupting across his face. Roz looked up, squinting at the landscape ahead of her, and felt something sharp. An ugly scratch her optic nerve. Looking at the sun was like staring into an eclipse. She gritted her teeth. Nothing up ahead, no buildings, no exits, definitely no TARDIS. Just a few rocks, nightmare-colored sand in the occasional gully. She heard the thing slipping over the dust at her heels, and tried not to think about what it looked like. She failed totally. It had just lain there, pockmarked and sand-blown, its big, bloated body expanding and contracting, like a sea creature washed up on a beach and gasping for water. Quite dead, the doctor had insisted, though he couldn't tell the cause. Its movement had been some kind of automatic function, the thing constantly adjusting and readjusting its shape even after death, still uncertain of the exact form it should take. He'd poked it with the end of his walking cane. He'd been trying to wean himself off the umbrella, and the body had split open like a ripe peach. There was no sign of the doctor now. She was on her own again, by accident, or design, with just the doctor's parting gift for company. She glanced down at the little shining sphere, cradled in her left hand. The amaranth. Goddess, why didn't they give these things proper names? Blasters, tensor guns, neuro whips. You knew where you were with that kind of technology. What the hell was an amaranth supposed to do? Useful, the doctor had said, 5 minutes before the world had opened up and dragged her down into its shadow. Just that, as he'd pressed the sphere into her hands. Useful. Cwej had been fascinated by the alien corpse, of course. Sure, he'd made uke noises, but underneath it all he had a kind of morbid curiosity that a 14-year-old would have been proud of. Roz had glanced into the split in the thing's body, but only briefly. Coils, cords, knotted tissues, liquid pathways. It had been like looking into the workings of a visceral computer, but the patterns wouldn't stay still, the connections constantly splitting and rearranging, breaking off to form new circuits and new systems. Is it an android? Cwej had asked, eager to be part of the doctor's investigation. Roz had rolled her eyes. It hadn't looked like an android at all, no face or hands or joints, nothing to identify it as the work of a humanoid species. The doctor had shaken his head. Gynoid. Gynoid? Roz stumbled as she made her way down a slope, regaining her balance but feeling something twist and pop in her ankle. The thing was gaining on her. Had to be. Did you ever stop to think about the word android? Single quote. He'd said, addressing himself as much as anyone else. Did you ever stop to think about what it means? Cwej had shrugged. Robot. Machine that looks like a man, right? Single quote. No. The doctor had turned away, and the split skin of the dead thing had sealed itself up in seconds. Android. From the Greek, ana, andros, meaning man. Oid, meaning like. Single quote. Cwej had looked confused, which was hardly a novelty. A machine that's like a man. That's what I said. You said a machine that looks like a man. There's a difference. Single quote. What? There was a moment's silence as the thing hit the bottom of the slope behind her. And for a moment Rose wondered if it had broken its neck, but a second more and it was whispering to her again, bright coppery syllables that licked at the nerves along her spine. Should have known better, she thought. Gynoids probably don't even have necks. Gynoid. Stupid name. Like a make-believe alien out of an imperial propaganda syncord. Earth versus the gynoid. Menace. Single quote. Goddess, it'll look bloody awful on my headstone. And then, with almost cinematic timing, she tripped. Single quote. The witch skulls of Peking, a perfect pentagram burned into the forehead of everyone. Our investigators believe that their owners were still alive when the marks were made, no doubt being involved in some long-forgotten pagan rite. Here, the clockwork fantastique, found in the ruins of an 11th century village, yet inexplicable even today. And here, a set of Egyptian manuscripts, found by our own Cardinal Scarlett, describing a world built by one-eyed supernatural horrors. Single quote. Absently, Cardinal Catalan realized that he should have been enjoying this more. In all the years he'd been custodian of the collection, this was the first time he'd had the opportunity to show the curiosities to anyone from outside the church. At the very least, he should have been showing off his encyclopedic knowledge of the exhibits, explaining the satanic rituals described in the Boreanu tapestries, pointing out the heretical hidden messages in the Da Vinci portrait of John the Baptist. But the French woman seemed unresponsive, somehow unconcerned, as if she'd seen it all before. Which wasn't very likely, Catalan reflected. The woman stopped in front of one of the larger glass-fronted cases, and Catalan risked a good long look at her. She was a tall woman, her body not so much thin as somehow pained, her spidery limbs cloaked by a mud-colored chemise, dark hair trickling down her back, her sharp, wide-eyed face head that haunted, some would say, scared look that Catalan had noticed in many survivors of the French Revolution, the skin interrupted by a circular red mark set into her left cheek. Catalan briefly wondered what had happened to her. The mark looked like a burn, about the same shape and width as a decent-sized coin. A thin layer of makeup just failed to disguise it. He was about to turn away when he noticed the way she was standing, back curiously crooked, fingertips against the glass. She looked like she was in pain. Mademoiselle? Mademoiselle Duquesne? The woman snapped into an upright position. Cardinal. There is, a problem? You look unwell. If there's anything wrong. No. No, not at all. Please, continue. It's almost interesting. Please. She attempted a smile, and Catalan noticed her hand reach for the base of her spine, as if to scratch it. Something about the movement was familiar. Ah. Of course. If I might ask a question, mademoiselle, he said, before he had a chance to thinking about what he was saying, were you at all familiar with, Cardinal Roche? Roche? No. No, I don't believe so. The previous custodian of the collection of necessary secrets. My predecessor. Here. Catalan indicated the hall around him, moving his small and crumpled frame in a complete circle, as if to embrace the whole of its undusted majesty. Cardinal Roche was gifted, shall we say? He possessed a certain gift, which he believed to be a boon from the higher orders of creation. A blessing. Perhaps. He caught Duquesne's eye. I believe that pagan peoples would call it the sight, Catalan went on. A sense, a sixth sense one might say, for the uncanny and the improper. To me, the collection is merely a building full of oddities. To Roche, it was much more. He claimed he felt a burning in his spine whenever he grew close to certain objects, as though his body could sense the very strangeness of them. He once told me that he could often hear whispers from the skeletons and the fossils, and wondered if they wished to relate their peculiar histories to him. He'd been watching Duquesne as he spoke, and he'd seen her hand involuntarily shoot back to her spine. That was it. The woman was sensitive, just as old Roche had been. Probably the only reason why her employers had sent her here. The French weren't in the habit of using women as agents. How fascinating, she said, flatly. Indeed, said Catalan, deciding not to tell her that Roche had gone quite mad and cut his own throat open with one of the collection's sharper exhibits. What do men do? The doctor had asked, turning his back on them. The question had been directed at Cwej, which was a pity, as Roz had thought of about half a dozen smart answers in no time at all. Cwej had said. Give up. The same things as women, Roz had muttered, but without wiping the sick off the furniture afterwards. There was a furrow, a tiny indentation in the ground, and Roz had run right into it, catching the toe of her boot against the lip and losing her balance. Instinctively she threw her arms out in front of her, realizing that it probably didn't make much difference how you fell if there was an alien monster breathing down your neck. She felt the amaranth slip out of her grasp. No. Not the same at all. The doctor had paused, as if he had difficulty getting to grips with this subject himself. The male and female of the species, of every humanoid species, have completely different psychologies. Evolution made sure that their brains were suited to very different tasks. Usually the two perspectives lock together, and no one even notices the join. Nobody spots the difference. Usually, that's how civilizations are made. Roz had folded her arms impatiently, wondering what this had to do with dead aliens, and Cwej had looked like he hadn't been following any of it. Men build, the doctor had continued, his Gaelic inflection becoming more noticeable by the second. Their fundamental purpose is to act as architects. Towers, pillars, bridges. All men's things. In a man's world, everything has to be defined, named, planned with precision. Things have to be conquered, not accepted. No patch of earth is complete until it has a building on it. An orderly, precise, geometrically exact building. Roz rolled as she hit the ground, and realized that she was on top of another slope. Fine by her. She pushed herself over the edge, picking up momentum as she spun downhill. Once in every 360-degree roll, she could see the gynoid as a gray blur framed against the unnatural black of the sky. There was something else, too, a flash of gold, somewhere nearby. The amaranth. Obviously. Towers and pillars. Right. Roz had remembered an academy lecture on Freudian symbolism in the psychology of the serial killer, and remembered that she hadn't listened to most of it. Routine procedure when faced with a serial killer was to blow his kneecaps off, so she'd never understood what his psychology had to do with anything. And women? Different instincts. The female psyche has no need to construct, no need to control. Cwej had giggled, but they'd ignored him. No need to define. The female psyche is adaptable, mutable. That's why little boys dream of killer robots and little girls dream of fairy queens. A generalization, of course. In many cultures, men tend to see that difference as a weakness, which is probably why killer robots are always in fashion and fairy queens get such a bad press. They don't see it as a weakness, a voice had said. They see it as a threat. There had been a moment of shocked silence. It had been Cwej's voice, but Roz couldn't believe that it had been Cwej speaking. This was Chris Cwej, for Goddess Sake, Chris Cwej, who'd had a bedroom full of toy anti-grav starfighters, Chris Cwej, who'd once spent 6 hours in the TARDIS wardrobe, trying on every single pair of sunglasses in the doctor's collection until he'd found the ones he thought were neatest. He'd been having these moments of inspiration ever since Yamaya, Roz had noticed, but where the hell had that little pearl of wisdom come from? The doctor had looked as if he'd just been dealt a killing blow, as if the comment had been a personal attack on him. Perhaps he'd conceded. Her back slammed into something, and Roz realized that she'd rolled into a large rock, positioned right at the bottom of the slope. whichever god or goddess put that there, she thought as the pain crackled up her spine, should be making Tom and Jerry cartoons. But the whispering was getting closer, and she looked up towards the advancing gynoid, determined to face death head-on. It was a pathetic gesture, but it was the best she could do at short notice. Android, the doctor had repeated, meaning man-like. Not because it looks like a man, but because it's just like a man. Even if it looked like a woman, or a tiger, or a hairy monotreme, or a shapeless green blob, it would still be a man's machine. Perfectly ordered artificial life. The ultimate creation of the masculine psyche. Whereas, by contrast, and he'd pointed his cane at the corpse of the gynoid. The blur was rolling down the slope towards her, new orifices opening in its quicksilver skin every second. The whispers spilled into Roz's ears until they filled every avenue in her head and turned the world into static. She and Cwej had both glanced back at the dead thing, still quivering in the sun. Gynoid, Cwej had said, apparently back to normal. It's Greek, right? Gyno. Like woman. Yes. There'd been a strain in the doctor's voice, and he'd just failed to disguise it. And it shouldn't be here. Of her? You mean, they don't build them round this part of the galaxy? Yeah? That was Cwej. Chief Inspector Cwej, determined to be on top of the case. You weren't listening. The doctor had scowled, though not at anyone in particular. Gynoids aren't built. Only androids are built. Gynoids just are. They just are, Roz thought. Yeah, right. And now one of them just is about to bite my legs off. Then there was something else, a high-pitched chiming, as the amaranth hit the rock next to her and rang like a bell. Even without looking, she could tell that it was spinning in the dust, making the same sound a glass makes when you run your finger around the rim. Louder, though, loud enough to make her eardrums ache. The gynoid raised its many voices, trying to make itself heard above the screeching, and just for a moment Roz could almost tell what it was trying to say. Then the yellow light under the rock crept out into the darkness, folded itself around her, and blotted out the world. The skeleton within the case was that of a huge, lizard-like creature, a row of dagger-shaped spines punctuating its back. Catalin wondered if the woman was really looking at it, or just using it as an excuse not to catch his eye again. The bones were discovered in the great deserts of the New World, Catalin told her. As you can see, they belong to some behemoth which no longer walks the earth. My fellow cardinals insist that its species was destroyed during the Great Flood, though there is, as always, talk of God releasing unto them a great fire from heaven. Duquesne nodded. And His Holiness, God rest his soul, refused to let the skeleton be exhibited in public. God rest his soul. Yes. We have many skeletons like this one, or fragments of them. Shortly before his passing, His Holiness decided that all such relics should be interred here upon their discovery. The collection is, after all, a repository for those things which we feel it would be inappropriate for the general public to see. The discoverers of the bones are usually easy to pay off, their treasures brought here from around the world. Single quote. I did not quite understand. The woman's voice was strained, and Catalin guessed that she was trying to keep her sensitivity under control. Why such secrecy? Why should you keep such things from the eyes of the people? Catalin frowned. Those few men of reason who have examined them claim that the bones are older than one might expect. More than 6,000 years old. Which, according to the Holy Scripture, would seem to be older than the age of the earth, as created by our Lord. In death, then, these creatures accuse the scripture of fraud. Naturally, it does not do for such accusations to be made public. Duquesne was silent for a while, and Catalan wondered if he should continue with his half-hearted guided tour. And then, "This will not last forever," she said. "Mademoiselle? The Vatican cannot be in every place at once. Discoveries will soon be made that your fellow cardinals will overlook. The public will see all these things, which you have hidden from them for so long. Reason dictates it, perhaps, though even reason would fail to answer many of the mysteries in the collection, I'm sure. There is a skeleton of a man in our vaults that was found side by side with one of these great reptiles, while Cardinal Roche claimed to have seen the corpse of a creature that was halfway between man and fish, refuting both science and the book of Genesis." Catalan nodded contemplatively. "However, if there's one thing I refuse to argue with, it's the age of reason. At least, not with the French. A good Catholic not arguing with reason? Unthinkable." Catalan had asked for that, of course, but he let out a loud sniff anyway, as if mortally offended. She'd touched a nerve, it was true. The Vatican couldn't hold off the age of reason for much longer. Since His Holiness had died, the Church had been under the thumb of the bastard conqueror Bonaparte, and the world knew it. That was why the woman was here, come to survey the collection for little emperor, just as they'd survey all the Vatican's secret treasures, from the library of St. John the Beheaded in London to the living specimens of the Crow Gallery in southern Africa. Something vast and raw and new was forcing its way into the world, Catalan reflected, ripping up the traditions and the establishments, replacing monarchies with revolutionaries and revolutionaries with short French megalomaniacs. New rulers, new religions, a new century on its way. Catalan suddenly noticed that the woman had moved on and was standing frozen in front of an ancient scrap of parchment, covered with tiny dancing figures. Primitive art, Catalan told her. Hundreds of years old, though the fabric is of unknown manufacture. The illustration is of Shango, a god of lightning, thought to be the only pictorial representation of the deity in existence. But Duquesne wasn't listening. Her eyes had become glass baubles, her face flushed red as if she were about to burst into flames, her attention fixed on the little figure of Shango as he danced in front of the oblong, magic box with which, according to the parchments, he traveled a mystic triangle between the earth, the sky, and the future. "Caillou," Duquesne said, her voice reduced to a croak. Catalan opened his mouth to ask her what she meant, but she'd fainted dead away.